10. Here comes Jimmer. Long ball.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to Basketball in the Mountains. I'm your host, Tyler King. This is episode 5, and as the intro video today suggests, we are talking basketball in Utah once again. Last week, we had Patrick Mayhor on from the Ag Ship to talk about Utah State ahead of their big game against San Diego State last Saturday, which they won. Utah State's got another big game this weekend at Colorado State, which I'll be at on Saturday, which I'll talk about at the end. But today we're going a little bit further south to start the podcast. We'll start off in Salt Lake City, and then we'll go down to Provo to talk about BYU, who is just surging right now, winning 5 straight games and getting into that top 5 of the Big 12. So without further ado, today's guest is Sean Walker from KSL. Sean covers BYU, but really has his ear and eyes plugged in with everything going on in Utah and covers the Big 12 as well. So Sean, thanks for coming on Basketball in the Mountains.
No, appreciate you having me on, Tyler. Privileged to be here. Privileged to represent the other side of the Rocky Mountains. I know you guys got some pretty good mountains over there in the Denver area. I would put the ones we've got here on the Wasatch Front right up against you guys, but I don't want to start a bidding war to start this podcast either. So I'll just say thanks for having me.
Yeah, I mean, I love living out here on the Front Range here in Denver and traveling up and down I-25 and going to Boulder and Fort Collins all the time. But I have been to Salt Lake as well, and it is gorgeous. I was there last in 2023 for the CU Utah football game, and I'll be back there again this year when CU plays Utah. Looking forward to in a couple of years when CU football plays in Provo. To get to visit Provo as well. But I am a resident or I'm a native of the East Coast, so I am impartial toward all the mountains. I am, as a native Philadelphian, I've enjoyed all my time in the mountains. So
I tell people around here all the time that we really are just spoiled. Like, why are we comparing one to another? Because all of us are just pretty spoiled. Like, it really is silly. Whether you're in Logan, Salt Lake, Provo, Boulder, Fort Collins, whatever. Like, I just feel like I went out to Colorado Springs. I used to go out to Colorado Springs a lot when BYU was playing Air Force in the Mountain West Conference all the time. Like, another just absolutely gorgeous vista. It does seem kind of silly to compete, but we like competing with one another. What can I say, right? Rivalries or something.
Yeah, I lived in Colorado Springs for the first 2 years when I moved out here to Colorado, and Pikes Peak region is gorgeous as well. I still love going down there all the time throughout the year. But today we are here to talk about basketball, obviously in the Mountain Time Zone, which is why I've stated many times why I started this podcast, because I feel like it's an underappreciated region in the country with all the SEC and Big Ten teams getting in the NCAA tournament this year, just kind of dominating it. But still some really good basketball in this time zone here, and some really timely episode, I feel like, with Utah firing Craig Smith earlier this week. It was, I think the timing was a little bit strange, I think was the biggest thing. Sean, were you expecting this at all? I mean, Utah is kind of overperformed if you want to look at preseason expectations, where they were picked to finish even behind Colorado last in the preseason Big 12 media poll. And now I think they're 7-10. They were on a 2-game losing streak, but it feels like they've been a solid lower middle of the pack Big 12 team. And now they're searching for a new coach.
Yeah, it's weird because it does kind of feel like the Runnin Utes were one of the more overachieving teams this year in the Big 12, just based off of preseason projections. And that's weird to say. I know because of a team that is 3 games under 500 right now, I think they've actually got a chance to get to 500, or at least at the very least, they had a chance maybe before making the coaching change right there as well. But there was just such little energy, such little momentum around that program. You mentioned it picked dead last, 16 out of 16 teams in the conference. That any little bit of momentum, I think, was going to be taken with probably a grain of salt, but also with just some excitement as well. And I think Craig Smith had done just that. He just barely come off of winning back-to-back games against Kansas and Kansas State. The university celebrated those wins. The fan base got really excited over that. I know Kansas isn't typical Kansas right now. They're struggling some, back-to-back years under Bill Self, where any other program, if Bill Self, I think, were doing what he's doing at KU this year, you would go, okay, you're fine. Like one of the toughest conferences in America. Coach Self has such lofty Hall of Fame level expectations that rightfully so, it feels like a little bit of a disappointment where they're at the moment. And so I think proponents of Coach Smith and the Utes under his time there were going, okay, it does feel like things are maybe starting to click. Like maybe there's a chance that things could kind of get going and moving in the right direction. And then after those big wins, they head off to the East Coast, just get absolutely hammered by UCF, a UCF team that wasn't playing very well. That was a Sunday. And then the next morning, word started to trickle out. I think they made it official early Monday afternoon that Craig Smith's time with the Runnin Utes was done. Josh Eilert, former West Virginia head coach, will be the interim coach for the rest of the season. And then word also kind of started slowly trickling out that the Utes were already maybe talking to some candidates, some potential new candidates to replace Craig Smith at that time. Some pretty familiar names around here. There's even one name out there that's pretty familiar, I think, to your readers and your listeners on the other side of the Rockies in the Denver area. We'll get into some of those as well. So timing-wise, it does feel weird because it does feel like maybe things were starting to come together, or at the very least, like maybe Craig Smith could have had some time to show that things were coming together, maybe buying himself another year, kind of one of those put up or shut up type of years. And my only thinking with that is if you really wanted to make that change, if you're Mark Harlan, athletic director at Utah, who's under a little bit of heat right now as well for some of the public comments that he made after the BYU-Utah game pertaining to the Big 12. We were happy to join the Big 12, but tonight we are not. That one will forever live in infamy. And just some other little kind of snide, snarky comments that he's made about the league and otherwise up there. If you're Harlan and you really wanted to make that change, then it does kind of feel like maybe right now you sort of needed to almost in a way to maybe not give Craig Smith a chance to save his job, if that makes sense. Like if there was truly nothing he could do to keep himself from the chopping block this off season, then you probably needed to make the change just so that you weren't forced into keeping him. You didn't have like a Long Beach State situation, for example, with their tournament run last year and that sort of thing. So yes and no. Like from the outside, it does kind of seem like it was odd timing, but if you really kind of dive into the situation and what Craig Smith's 4 years up on the hill in Salt Lake City have been like, maybe you understand a little bit of why this had to take place.
Yeah, I think it's just because you just don't see a ton of coaching dismissals with like a week and a half left to go in the regular season. But what you said makes a lot of sense. Like if they were dead set on moving on regardless, like you said, don't even give him the chance to win the fan base back with some kind of magical run in Kansas City, where even if they win 2 or 3 games in the Big 12 tournament to get to the semis or even the championship game, seems outlandish, but I mean, nothing is unlikely in March, but just kind of getting ahead of it now, you're able to look at who you want to replace him, whether even it's a college guy or you're looking to the pros, which I think we'll talk about some of the candidates. It just definitely feels like his time had run out there just because of, and maybe the program just is getting the fan base is a little agitated, just begging for some kind of NCAA tournament success, just births. I think it's 2016, the last time they made it. Like you're just kind of looking for some kind of consistency and a path forward to being up toward even the middle of the pack in the Big 12.
Yeah, and Harlan did mention in the statement that he released when he let go Craig Smith, when he fired him, essentially that the program did have higher expectations than where they were at under Craig, and I think there is some truth to that. Certainly, there's some truth to that for those who maybe grew up on Utah basketball in like the mid to late 90s and early 2000s under the legend that was Rick Majerus and a little bit under some of his successors as well. It's been a little bit of a downhill slog since then, but consider also what Coach Smith had the rest of the year. Obviously, they had number 22 Arizona. That was the first loss under Josh Eilert's interim era, I guess, is what it turned into. But can you imagine if Utah pulled off an upset there? Now, I'm not sure if it would have happened, but imagine if it would have, right? Then they get Arizona State, which I think is a very winnable game with the state of that program and where Bobby Hurley has them right now. I think they only played 7 or 8 players the other night against BYU. Yeah. So obviously on some tough times there. Then they get West Virginia, which that's probably maybe a 50-50 game, but I might even favor Utah on that one as well. And then obviously the end of the season with in-state rival BYU, they've already beat them once in Salt Lake City. If Utah sweeps BYU and then does something like you were saying, wins a game or two in the Big 12 tournament, whether or not they get into the NCAA tournament, maybe they get an NIT bid, it looks really tough to kind of let go of Craig Smith at that time. So I do think I'm not reporting anything here. There's a little bit of speculation, maybe some mildly informed speculation, nothing more than that. But I do think there was maybe a feeling of getting in front of this news a little bit and trying to get a jump start on the coaching carousel and the coaching search for a new leader of Utah basketball.
Yeah, it's actually ironic that I covered Utah's last postseason basketball game when they were in the NIT final against my alma mater, Penn State, in 2017 at the Garden. I was at that game sitting courtside and covering it for the student newspaper at Penn State, which is ironic. But I mean, that just kind of shows how long ago that was that Utah was kind of even irrelevant in that sense. And now I know the recruiting, there's been some recruiting struggles the last couple of years, just even in the last couple of years in the Pac-12, consistently near the bottom of the rankings. And now in the Big 12, it's a similar thing. I just feels like they needed to build some momentum and just get some juice behind the program. And a new face always kind of can do that for a program. So let's talk a little bit about potential replacement candidates. I mean, who are the names that come to mind for you, and just kind of what do you feel like Utah is going to be looking for and for the next phase of the program here?
Yeah, so there are a couple of names that have sort of jumped off the page as fans are kind of hypothetically going in and kind of thrown out in the community. Alums and boosters and donors are certainly weighing in on the search right now, and two of them it does seem like they come up pretty much anytime Utah basketball has an opening. 2 alums of the program, very widely respected alums from even the program's glory days under Coach Majerus and so forth. And I mentioned one of them, your readers and your listeners over there in the Denver area probably know. That's current Grand Rapids coach Andre Miller. He's a Utah product, obviously played for Majerus at the U, first-round draft pick, number 8 overall in 1999, before he played about a decade in the NBA or so, including, I think, a short stint with the Nuggets.
He did play with the Nuggets.
Yeah,
and my Sixers, that's true.
Played with your Sixers as well. Yeah, I mean, played with a number of teams. Portland, Washington, had a cup of coffee with Sacramento, Minnesota, San Antonio. I think is where he formally retired out of as well. And Andre's been one of those guys. He's got his number 24 retired by the university. Did that a couple of years ago. Former WAC Player of the Year, multi-time All-American by different organizations. If you will. And his name is constantly brought up in terms of like finding a way to sort of reinvigorate or rejuice the program, which I think that's the biggest issue right now, is not necessarily that, fans are down, results aren't necessarily there. You kind of expect that. But maybe the most dangerous point of any coach's tenure at a particular school or with a particular team isn't when fans and those around the program like even actively hate it. It's apathy. And fans for the last few years even have been very apathetic towards Utah basketball. A lot of them come and say they see the success that Kyle Whittingham's having on the football side, for example, and Utah's a football school now. Basketball's great. If they can be good, that's fine. That's wonderful. But really, all that matters is what happens in the fall, because ever since Urban Meyer, they've been a football school, and Kyle Whittingham has certainly built on that success, regardless of the 5-7 season they had last year. Back-to-back Rose Bowl appearances. I think you can certainly make that argument. So a guy like Andre Miller is sort of the anti-apathy of Utah basketball. Connection to the glory days. He's been in the business for a while. I mentioned it. He's currently the head coach of the Grand Rapids Gold. That's the Nuggets G League affiliate out in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Things aren't going very well there right now. So you do wonder, maybe that's sort of part of the name floating. I don't know if he's been a he's only been there for 2 years, so I wouldn't necessarily expect
He is
him
pretty
to
well liked in
be
the
fired.
organization, from what I know in Denver.
Yeah, but he's not hitting it out of the park. I'll say that. I think that's probably the best way to describe him right there. So there's that name floating around out there, and I know Andre is always pretty popular, a pretty big name to talk to. The other one that gets brought up all the time is another Utah alum, Alex Jensen. He's a Utah native, former Deseret Newsminster basketball in high school out of Viewmont High School in the Bountiful area. He's a member of the LDS Church, so he connects with the community really well. And then obviously played for Rick Majerus in those glory days. He was on the 1998 national championship game team as well there. He spent his entire coaching career, I believe, in professional basketball, primarily in the NBA. He spent a decade with the Utah Jazz, eventually rose to be a front of the bench assistant there. And then the last 2 years, he's been with the Dallas Mavericks, which I don't know if that's a mark on his resume or not. I'll let you decide based off of where the Mavs are at the moment and with certain, we'll say, blockbuster trades that have gone down recently. Maybe now is the time for him to get out. And I think when there's an opening, Alex Jensen's name is very naturally going to be a way to, again, connect to the fan base and maybe just provide a little bit of a spark for a group that has been apathetic. Maybe even if somebody like Alex Jensen's not overly experienced as a head coach, can he energize the fan base? Can he get the donors involved? Can he bring in some NIL? And that sort of thing. And I think that's actually maybe one of the most important pieces to consider with this hire. It's not necessarily what a coach can do X's and O's wise, or what they can do on the court in terms of program building, but what can they do to bring in people around him to succeed in this current era of college basketball? And when you talk about that, you've obviously got to talk about name, image, and likeness. Got to talk about revenue sharing coming up. You've got to talk about connections and maybe bringing guys in to build towards the NBA or pro ball or that kind of thing. I think Alex is a pretty natural fit when it comes to those types of specifications.
Yeah, and just kind of looking at what BYU has done in recent years, bringing in a guy like Kevin Young, who was seemingly a candidate for multiple NBA jobs the last couple of years, and now has quickly revolutionized the way BYU has recruited, bringing in a 5-star this year with Yegor Demin, arguably the number 1 player in the country, coming in next year with AJ DeBansa. I mean, they have quickly, we'll talk about this a little bit when we get to BYU, just they have quickly revolutionized and reinvigorated the program. They made the tournament last year, lost to Duquesne, but now are once again going to be an NCAA tournament team this year. I mean, that's kind of what Utah is competing against. And even some of the college names, whether it's Richard Pitino, who's been mentioned a little bit, although I feel like he's maybe more of a candidate for some other jobs in the country, like Florida State. Bryce Drew is interesting too. A guy in has done a good job at Grand Canyon the last couple of years. Scott Drew's younger brother. I mean, that's a little interesting, but I do feel like whether it's Alex or Andre, kind of one of those former players, guys who has NBA ties, could really be a nice, like I said, we use the word a lot, but reinvigorating hire and just kind of getting some more interest back in the program, because that's what it takes to get NIL money and to get the recruits and the players you need, whether it's out of high school or in the transfer portal, because that's the name of the game. And it's similar to what the issues I've been dealing with, or the program I cover most heavily, Colorado, has been dealing with. They're kind of in a similar situation. Tad Boyle has a lot more leeway than Craig Smith does, as a guy who's in year 15 in Boulder, and is the winningest program in coach history, or winningest coach in program history. But it's very similar. There's just a lot of apathy. I think you described toward Utah is very similar how CU fans have been towards the Buffs basketball program in the last couple of years. Yeah, it's nice like last year when they have 3 NBA draft picks and make the NCAA tournament, but this year it's like, okay, they're kind of back to what we expect. Bottom of the Big 12, just kind of rebuild mode. And I'm not saying for CU a coaching change is coming at all, but for Utah, who is now actively looking for a new coach, the best way to get interest back in the program is to kind of make the splash higher and hope it works out on the coaching side as well, whether it's Andre Miller or Alex Jensen. It feels like either of those guys would be a pretty good candidate at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And remember, Craig Smith, ended up winning the press conference in the end based off of results, but he was an extremely successful coach at Utah State when he made the move up to Utah. Maybe a little bit less so in terms of like the Ute program building, the Ute connections, that sort of a thing. So I wouldn't be surprised to potentially see the athletic department kind of pivot in the opposite direction with this next hire. We shall see in the coming days or weeks or months or however long it takes them to kind of carry through with it, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't expect Jared Calhoun to be the guy. I mean, it seems like Utah State is working on getting an extension done with him. This is something Patrick and I talked about on last week's episode. It would be really a gut check for Aggies fans to go through another one and done coach after quickly, another special season, NCAA tournament, and then coach is gone. I really do think Jared Calhoun's going to be there in Logan for a couple of years at least.
If they did, though, I predict the Aggies to win the Mountain West and probably win another 20 games next year if they did have another first-year coach, because that's just what they do at this point.
That is exactly what they do. They keep guys around, and they've done a good job with the NIL stuff as well, keeping some of the talented players around from last year's roster. So switching over, we'll go a little bit south to Provo to talk about a team that is doing really well and not in the midst of a coaching search. We're going to talk about BYU, now a 5-game winning streak. They're in the top third of the Big 12 standings, I think tied with Iowa State for fourth at like 11-6. Yeah, 11-6 in the Big 12. 9-2 in their last 11 games, which this last 11 games started in Boulder. I covered the game when they came to CU and beat the brakes off them in the second half of that game, which is a bunch of really impressive wins lately. They kicked the crap out of Kansas at home. Then they had the slightly controversial win over Arizona on the road, which is
slightly.
Yes, slightly. I was being a little kind there, but it's easily their biggest win of the season. Getting a win over an Arizona team that is still in second place in the Big 12 on the road. McHale is never an easy place to go and win, and BYU did it. Whatever you want to say about the ending, they still got the win, and it's just been a remarkable turnaround. And they're finally turning into the team that I expected. I was high on BYU coming into the year, and they're really starting to live up to that and play some of their best basketball at the right time.
Yeah, and I think they're turning into the team that a lot of fans certainly expected. When you talk about Kevin Young, the highest paid assistant coach in the NBA by the end of his tenure with the Phoenix Suns, he was a candidate for multiple head coaching positions there in the league. Came into BYU, came into Provo with really high expectations, multi-million-dollar contract, long-term stability, and promises to turn Provo with an emphasis on the PRO part, right? Capital P, capital R, capital O, VO, into an NBA factory, into a professional factory. So taking guys from the high school ranks, putting them through however long they spend at BYU, and then sending them off to professional careers, NBA draft picks, that sort of thing. And it didn't get off to a great start. This was a team that, they didn't play a very challenging non-conference schedule, 320 something in the country, I think it was. And they just didn't really do a whole lot. Then they struggled to start Big 12 play. They were, I think 2-5 out of the gate, or 1-4, something like that. They had that loss that I mentioned on the hill to Utah by 1 point in overtime. And then it does feel like something's kind of changed from right around them. I think it actually goes back to that loss to Utah. Results-wise, it probably goes back to that time in that game in Boulder. BYU hadn't won a true road game up to that point. They were looking for their first. They were devoid of quad one wins. They didn't really have much of a resume. They get that win at Colorado. Say whatever you will about Colorado and where their season's gone, but that almost like flipped a switch with this team to where they started to just believe a little bit more in what they were doing, trusting a little bit more in Kevin Young and some of his assistants, Will Voigt, Chris Burgess, Tim Fanning, John Linehan, etc. And they started to just buy into the system to the point where they've now won 5 in a row. I think it's 9 of their last 11, if my math adds up correctly, and tied for 4th in the Big 12 Conference after Iowa State unexpectedly lost the other night as well. That game, by the way, next week, BYU is going to go to Ames in an absolutely massive game, I think, for potential seeding when it comes to the conference tournament, and maybe even seeding when it comes to the NCAA tournament as well. That game probably decides and maybe even locks in what the top 4 seeds look like for the Big 12 tournament, which, as you know, Tyler, is those 4 teams that will get double buys straight into the quarterfinals in Kansas City.
Yeah, Iowa State's got Arizona in Ames on Saturday night as well. That's some
That's
more
a heck of
really
a back-to-back right there.
Yeah,
Of our own NBA term.
Yeah, you mentioned BYU's struggles on the road, and this is something I remember you and I talked about when we first met down in San Antonio. We were both covering the Alamo Bowl, just talking about BYU basketball. Obviously, they hadn't won a true road game at that point. They beat Colorado in January, and now they've won 5. They've got 5 true road wins in the Big 12, and that's kind of been the most impressive part. Like, they go on the road and beat West Virginia. They beat UCF, 2 teams in the bottom half of the Big 12, obviously Arizona and Arizona State as well. But it's just been hard to win on the road in the Big 12 all season. You look at it, I think only 3 teams in the Big 12 have a above 500 record on the road. Houston's obviously 9-0. They're the kings of the road games in the Big 12. But Arizona and Texas Tech, 2nd and 3rd, are the only other teams with above 500 record in the Big 12. The other 13 teams are 500 or below. So that just kind of shows how valuable these road wins have been for BYU in recent weeks. And obviously, everyone kind of knew going into the season about Yegor Demin, a 5-star product out of Russia, a guy who's probably going to be a lottery pick in the upcoming draft. So he was dominating the headlines going into the season. But I mean, the biggest reason I feel like BYU is where they are is because of Richie Saunders and the kind of star leap he has made in his junior season there at BYU, just becoming he's been a really good shooter for a while, but just kind of doing it, still shooting at a high volume, or shooting at a higher volume and still doing it at a great efficiency is kind of the biggest thing for me with him. He's obviously been able to get to the basket in a variety of different ways as well. So his play, I feel like, is the biggest reason why they are where they are. Do you agree as well?
No, absolutely. And one of the things that that Kevin Young did say when he first got the job, I remember he was still in the middle of the playoff run with the Suns at the time, but he and his family flew to Provo for a press conference and meet some donors and that kind of thing to get introduced to the fan base. And he met with the remaining team, the team that was still there on campus in Provo at the time. And then he reiterated this in the press conference right afterward. He said he wanted every single one of these players to return to BYU, that he had these lofty expectations and hopes and dreams of turning BYU into an NBA factory. Obviously, we saw what they got with Yegor Demin and Cannon Catchings, another potential NBA draft pick right now, and others. But what he would have wanted more than anything else was to return every player on last year's roster that made the NCAA tournament and then just simply build on that. That didn't quite work out. BYU lost its leading scorer, Jackson Robinson, to Kentucky. Yep. A 4-star recruit who had signed with BYU. He followed Mark Pope to Kentucky as well after his mission, and Colin Chandler. But really beyond that, I mean, there were a couple of guys that transferred to Louisville and I think 1 or 2 others. But for the most part, I think he did a really nice job of keeping his core intact. And obviously the biggest one right there is Saunders, who's now leading the team in scoring. He's a 3-level scorer. He had 6 threes the other night against Arizona State, which turned into a bit of an unexpected shootout. BYU led by as many as 17 points, and ASU cut it kind of close, I guess, down the stretch. That I guess that's a little bit debatable, but BYU shot 17 threes, and a lot of that is because Coach Young brought back guys who had a system, who had a style of play, who knew how college basketball worked. And I'm thinking particularly of Richie Saunders and then Trevin Knell, who is also the big-time shooter. He's been at BYU for, it feels like, a decade. I think it's actually only been 6 years, but when you add in a church mission on top of that, I remember covering this kid in high school literally 10 years ago. He won a couple of state titles here in Utah as well back then. And so when you can, like, yes, I know the 5-star prospects, the Yegor Demins of the world, they're important in college basketball. That's how you really kind of take another leap and get to the next level. But it's when you can take that talent and put them to a core that knows the system, that understands each other, that has just chemistry and teamwork and all of those buzzwords. That's when I think the magic really starts to happen. It wasn't happening early, but again, kind of like in the NBA, college basketball is now something where you can maybe start off a little bit helter-skelter, a little bit rough, and as long as you have the resume to peak in February and March, that's the most important time of the year, obviously.
Yeah, and I really do feel like this team is built to win in March too. Like you've got Richie Saunders, who's the best player on the team. You've got Yegor Demin, who is kind of riding the waves as you will of a freshman season. What you would expect. You see, he's a great playmaker. Like some of the passes he makes are just stuff that other players on the court don't see. But then he has some of the turnovers, which you expect of a freshman. But you mentioned Trevenel. Like there's plenty of guys that on this team, whether it's down hall, I mean, Cannon Catchings, a bunch of guys that can get hot in a given game and really lead BYU to a big win. It feels like they can hunker down and win a rock fight of a game, but they also can win a shootout, like you mentioned the other night against Arizona State. They've got size on the interior as well to rebound the ball as well. Do you feel like they've kind of got all they need to right now and all the contributors necessary to make a run, whether it's at the Big 12 tournament in KC or in the NCAA tournament, depending on kind of what the seed and the matchup is there? But it feels like they've got what it takes.
Yeah, they're certainly figuring things out, I think, and they're figuring it out at the right time, being able to win in a whole bunch of different ways. They're a little bit light in the post, and that's maybe where I would caution kind of their one weakness is they don't have a big sturdy presence down low. Fus Traore has done a pretty nice job, but he's got his imperfections. Kebakeda's starting at the 5 right now, but he's sort of an untraditional, really good rebounder that works well enough as a rim runner and then the shot blocker the last couple of weeks in particular, I guess, in Kevin Young's offense. But in terms of just like a big man to kind of eat up a lot of space down low, I think that's sort of their Achilles heel at the moment. But they're not letting that heel really get to them, whether it's just using spacing or, like I mentioned, Fus Traore coming in and just giving him good enough minutes, Kebaketa giving him good enough minutes, doing what he does best to kind of make those inconsistencies or maybe some of those inefficiencies not mean as much. So, yeah, I mean, this is a team where if they play at their best, I think I said it at the start of the year, and I started to look like a total idiot at early on and as Big 12 play was starting. But if this team plays at its best, just based off of overall talent and normal talent, it's probably a second weekend team in March. It's the type of team that can win a game, maybe 2 in there. I'm not saying they're going to the Final Four. I probably wouldn't project that. But Sweet 16, Elite 8, like somewhere in there, I think just talent-wise, this team could certainly get there if they live up to their potential. And they're starting to show flashes of being able to play to that potential right now, which I think, again, here as we speak in late February is a really good sign for March.
Yeah, it always depends on seeding, like I mentioned. And right now, ESPN has them projected as an 8 seed, playing, ironically, Utah State in the first round in the 8-9 game. That would be fascinating. With the unfortunate
BYU, Cougar and Aggie fans definitely have not noticed that. Not at all.
The unfortunate winner of that game would get Florida, which I don't wish anyone to get an 8 or 9 seed this season with just how good the 1 seeds look to be. But I mean, BYU, they could easily get up to a 7 seed at this point. I mean, whether it's net or KenPom, whatever you want to look at, their underlying statistics are really good, especially on the offensive side of the ball. But they close with two out of 3 games they should win: home against West Virginia on Saturday, and home against Utah the following Saturday, with the game at Iowa State mixed in between. Obviously, the rivalry game against the Utes might be a little bit trickier than your run-of-the-mill Big 12 home game. But you go 2-3 down the stretch, you get maybe the 5 seed, or maybe you can get up to the 4 seed in the Big 12 tournament and get that automatic bid to the quarters. And you're 1 win away from the semis, and then you're in kind of a big-time game against a really good team. That's another potential really big resume booster game. I mean, just how important is the run in here for BYU, or is it just about kind of finding the right matchup, whether it is in KC for the Big 12 tournament and then obviously in the NCAA tournament as well?
Yeah, college basketball is all about matchups, really. But yeah, I mean, I agree. There's still, and we're down the stretch of the Big 12 season. BYU's got 20 wins for I think it's the 3rd time in 5 years or something like that. They're just collecting back to back to back 21 seasons like they're candy sometimes. And maybe most importantly, they still have pretty much everything to play for. Now, not a Big 12 title. I think Houston, I don't know if they mathematically have that locked up. I think they've locked up at least a share of the Big 12 title officially, but they're winning.
Yeah, they
Big
have a
12.
share at least. Yeah.
Yeah. They're winning the Big 12 right now. So maybe a conference championship is obviously out, but there's still everything to play for at this point, sitting in the conference tournament, sitting in the NCAA tournament. The best finish in a power conference in program history is still very much on the table. Now, obviously, it's a very limited history. This is BYU's second year in the Big 12, so I say that a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but only a little bit as well, because I'm not sure anybody expected BYU basketball to be able to adapt to a conference like the Big 12 so quickly into their run in one of those day in, day out, game in, game out power conferences that are categorized as one of the toughest in the country. Obviously, the Big 12 for the last 2 or 3 years probably was. I probably wouldn't put them above the SEC this year by any means, but I think they're still top 2, top 3 at the moment. And for BYU to be a top 4, 5, at worst, a top 6 team right now in the Big 12, only 2 years into their tenure in this league and with a brand new coach, I think speaks volumes to what this program, what the school can do in basketball. And another thing, I made this joke a little bit after the Kansas game on Twitter. It didn't play as well with the BYU fan base as I expected, but maybe I probably should have read the room a little bit better. But who would have expected 2 years into Big 12 play for BYU men's basketball to be 2-0 in Kansas and BYU football's 0-2 against the Jayhawks? I'm not sure anybody called that 2 years ago, but obviously there's a lot of context. I get it. But yeah, I mean, I think that there is actually a potentially really high ceiling on this BYU basketball program, and I'm not sure they're anywhere near it just yet, which has got to be exciting if for those in and around the program.
Yeah, that's the thing I wanted to end on here with BYU is like it really does feel like, and this is something I have been thinking about as well, like they are really well positioned to become one of the top consistently 5 or 6 teams in the Big 12. Like I think Houston is not going anywhere anytime soon, winning the regular season again. Arizona has done a great job. I really like what Texas Tech has done. Iowa State's in a good shape as long as TJ Otzelberger's there. Kansas is probably not going anywhere despite the disappointment this year. But I do think BYU could be in that group going forward with what Kevin Young has done in only one season and with what he's already got coming on board for next season. Like Richie Saunders is only a junior. He could be back next season and be one of a preseason all Big 12 player for sure, maybe in the preseason player of the year. Like that's not off the table. And you add that with AJ DeBansa, the number 1 player in the country coming in. Who knows who else they could add in the transfer portal to kind of replenish.
Considered one of the best centers in the country, also signed with BYU. Yeah.
Sure. Exactly. And they could add in the transfer portal to replace some of the seniors they're going to lose this year. It just doesn't really feel like BYU is in a perfect spot to take advantage and consistently be one of these programs in the Big 12 that's top 5 or 6. And in the Big 12 right now, top 5 or 6, you're guaranteed to be in the NCAA tournament. That's just how it's going to be. Like they're going to get 8, 9 bids every year. And if you're in the top 5 or 6 consistently, that means you're winning 20 plus games and you're getting to the NCAA tournament. And like you said, potentially have the potential to get to the second weekend just about every year too.
Yeah, for sure. They're really kind of starting to feel, I think, the right groove on that men's basketball team right now. And I think there's a lot of momentum and a lot of hype in Provo for being a basketball school again. I mean, this was a program that back in like the 40s and 50s, like basketball was kind of the sport. It was what they were. And then this guy named Lavelle Edwards came along. Maybe you've heard of him, maybe not. Just kidding. College Football Hall of Famer. He's a legend in these parts at BYU, and he got that BYU football program running. And basketball, to be quite frank, kind of fell a little bit off the radar, just in terms of attention, in terms of bandwidth and that sort of thing. And now fans are starting to feel a little bit more like, oh, maybe there is a good ceiling at BYU in basketball. Kind of like there's a good ceiling, I think, in college basketball at a lot of colleges in the state of Utah.
All right. Well, that'll do it from us here talking about BYU. Thanks, Sean, for coming on. You can follow him at at actually DSW on X. You can follow him on Blue Sky. Just search for Sean Walker. Read all of his work at KSL. Sean, thanks for being one of my first guests here. I'm sure you'll be a regular in the coming years to talk about BYU because this, like we said, this program doesn't feel like it's going anywhere.
No, I appreciate it, Tyler. Anytime. And like I said, I love having the three-headed monster at BYU, Utah, and Colorado in the same conference. It's great. Let's keep this going. And I'll be seeing you in Boulder next year at the very least.
That's true.
Even if we don't cross paths at that Denver regional, there's a chance. We were talking a little off mic. Maybe there's a chance we cross paths there. But Kalani Sitake and Coach Prime are going to get the rematch to, I think,
yes,
the
they
Open
will.
Conference play next year. So we'll see you by then.
It won't be Colorado's opener. They play at Houston because they have a weird.
That's right, because BYU has that bye bye the week before. Yeah, so that's why.
But it'll be a big game in late September in Boulder. CU and BYU football, which we'll both be at that game. So thanks again for coming on, Sean. That'll do it from us here at Basketball in the Mountains. Thanks everybody for listening and watching. If you're doing so on YouTube, make sure to rate, review, subscribe everywhere you get your podcast. Just quick look at the weekend ahead. Like I said earlier in the podcast, I will be in Fort Collins this week for CSU against Utah State, a massive game for the Rams and the Aggies in terms of who gets positioning and seeding for the Mountain West. Both those teams are gunning for second place, it feels like, in the Mountain West. Colorado's at Kansas State on Sunday. They've got 3 games left in the regular season before they're all done. But BYU on Saturday night against West Virginia as they continue to play for seeding in the Big 12. And then Arizona at Iowa State, I mentioned earlier in the podcast. Wildcats looking to bounce back after the loss to the Cougs earlier this week in Tucson. Now they have to go to Ames on Saturday night in a game that could be really, really pivotal for Big 12 seeding. So thanks, everyone, for listening, and enjoy the weekend of basketball.